Okay, John, you can start.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tricia, Hilary, and the other officers for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to speak to the Kent Family History Society. Um, my topic is about the book, which I've just published, actually, called the Tithe War. I'm going to share my screen now. This was a major historical event, and Kent was at the centre of conflict, which is described in this book. We're talking about a campaign by rural communities against the remnants of the medieval tithe, the 10% of produce that was paid to the church and other tithe owners. And the book covers what is described as a tithe war that begins in 1881 and reaches a climax in the 1930s. It's a tithe war that featured on the front pages of the national press, that embroiled the major politicians of the day, and was a major headache for leading figures in the Anglican Church. And it's a story, I feel, that is neglected in the history books. The fact that the medieval tithe continued into the 20th century remains relatively unknown. So what I'm going to do now is explain, outline what happened. It's sketch anyway what happened. It's impossible to go into all the details, but mention some of the main characteristics and personalities involved in the Tithe War. And I've got to speak a little bit about how the book came about and the research process behind the book, and perhaps some of the sources that may be of interest to you in your own research. So my research began as a local history project. About 16 years ago, I moved to Shepherd's Well and became interested in an incident that took place in the village in 1934. It featured on the front page of the Evening Standard. You can see the headlines there: Tithe Battle of Ducks. And it was covered by all the national press. You can see 150 masked men raid a Kent farm at midnight. 60 ducks seized, re-seized, and then seized again. And yet nobody in the village, including the farmer of the farm concerned, knew about this story. And so I began a research project for the local history society. I'll just read you a little bit more from the article, which I've put on the screen, which summarizes what the story is about. It says, an astonishing battle of the ducks is being fought in the Kent Tithe War. Yesterday, 60 ducks were seized under a tithe distressed order at the farm of Reverend R.M. Hedwood at Westwell, Horfield, near Ashford. Today, very early in the morning, 150 masked men drove up to the Ecclesiastical Commissioner's farm at Westcourt, Shepherd's-Well, and re-seized the ducks. They drove back to Ashford and put the ducks on Mr. Hedwood's pond again. A police superintendent, a sergeant, and 3 policemen rushed to Mr. Kedwood's farm to intercept the raiders, failed, and then spent 6 hours re-rounding up the ducks. So that's the story. So a trip to the National Archives found a sizable dossier about this event with police reports, witness statements, and many of the details of the main people involved. Most of these so-called raiders and masked men were farmers, farmers' sons, their friends, their neighbours, mainly from the Elam Valley, but also there were groups from villages around Sandwich and Deal. So let's explain what this story is about. The Reverend Roderick Kedward, there he is on the top left-hand corner. He was a Methodist minister, and he had been the MP for Ashford between 1929 and 1931. He was a member of the Liberal Party. And he was also president of the National Tithe Payers Association. On the right of the screen, there's a monument there. This is a monument which is there today in Ashford Market. At the top, it just says Tithe, and is a monument to the Reverend Roderick Kedward for his role in the campaign against the tithe. The article mentions a distress order. Well, a distressed order is an order taken out in the county court against someone who has owes money. In this case, he refused to. Roderick Kedward had refused to pay his tithe, and so an order had been taken out to seize produce from his land, from his farm. Roderick Kedward owed tithe to the ecclesiastical commissioners and the Queen Anne's Bounty, which was a church institution which collected tithe. And so Kedward's stock was put up to tender. A field of wheat, machinery, farm machinery, a bull, pigs, and 56 Indian runner ducks were put up to tender, and they were bought by a company called General Dealers. And General Dealers was a company which I'll mention a little bit more later on. It was set up by church institutions in total secret in order to really break the campaign by the tithe payers against the tithe, because the Tithe Payers Association that Roderick Kedward was the president of was waging a non-payment campaign. They were refusing to pay the tithe in order to draw attention to the unfairness of what they saw as a tax on agriculture, demanding that the government of the day, which was a national government, in reality a conservative-led government, demanding that they take steps to abolish this medieval tax. So on the 3rd of September 1934, General Dealers arrived at Kedward's farm, which was Beechbrook Farm in Westwell, and seized the bull, pigs, and the ducks. And they were taken to Westcourt Farm in Shepherdswell, which was a farm owned by the ecclesiastical commissioners. And the manager of the farm was told to look after the stock before they were removed and sold. Now, the 150 masked men in the press article is a bit of an exaggeration. There was about 100. Only a few of them wore masks. This was a group, supporters of the East Kent Tithe Payers Association. They assembled at 11 o'clock at night at the halfway house on the Dover Road. I don't know if you know the road between Canterbury and Dover. Halfway down the A2, it's now been demolished, an old coaching inn called the Halfway House. They assembled there. They were mainly young people, a variety of people, as I say, farmers' sons, but others as well, including one serving soldier. The ringleaders are in that photograph at the top, men mainly from Elam, George Gill, David Gill, and Kingsley Dykes. The three figures at the front of the photograph there, they were the main organisers of the affair. So there was a briefing at the halfway house, and a convoy travelled down the A2, the Dover Road as it was called, then to Westcourt Farm, woke up the farmer and his workers and asked to be taken to the stock. They thought twice about taking the bull and the pigs, but they loaded up a lorry with the ducks and they took them back to Kedward's farm in Westwell. Now, police were quickly on the scene, and a patrol of 20 police kept watch on the farm for almost a week after the event. The press had a field day. and pointed to the comical aspects of the affair, the Battle of the Ducks, and so on. But the authorities took the matter very seriously. This is in Home Office archives. The Under Secretary of State at the Home Office writes a memo at a time when the tithe question is so much a matter of controversy. That's interesting. A very serious view must be taken of such conduct on the part of opponents of tithe. It will be a good thing if the ringleaders would be brought to trial on a charge of conspiracy. And in fact, after this, there were 19 arrests and a trial at the Kent Assizes sitting in Maidstone. So that's how the book began, as a research project to find out more about this particular event. And the project started to grow into something much more because it was necessary to put the Battle of the Ducks into context, which led me to go back some centuries actually to trace the history of tithe. And why was it that it continued into the 20th century? And also, the Battle of the Ducks was part of a national campaign. What was the organization, the National Tithe Payers Association? What did it actually do? How big was the movement? Where else were things happening? So let's deal with the first point there about the history of tithe. There's not time to go into huge detail, but of course the origins of tithe are in the mists of time. But over the centuries, tithe was enshrined in ecclesiastical, common and parliamentary law. And it's left its mark today in Kent, mostly with the selection of tithe barns, which still exist. Many of them are now wedding venues. And of course, the museum in Maidstone was a former a tithe barn. Tithe was paid to church institutions, but particularly after the Reformation, around 1/3 of tithe was paid to private owners of tithe, including the Oxford universities, Cambridge universities, public schools, and big landowners. And you can trace many conflicts in Kentish history about the tithe. There's a book coming out soon written by Paula Simpson, who has studied what took place in the 16th century. And she's found 6,304 cases in the ecclesiastical courts about conflicts about tithe, a long drawn out, silent and undeclared war of evasion, fraud, concealment, dissimulation, non-compliance, and quiet defiance. Sorry, that's spelt wrong. Quiet defiance is what she finds. In the 1640s, we have a petition by people of Kent against tithe, and the abolition of tithe was one of the demands of the radical wing, the levellers and the diggers, in the parliamentary camp during the English Civil War. And this petition by the people of Kent described tithe as the continuation of Norman power. In other words, the power of the aristocracy. In the 1830s, the Captain's Swing riots, which we know mainly as riots against the threshing machines, was also a campaign against tithe. In Rotten, apologies if I pronounced that wrongly, between 400 and 500 labouring people gathered at the rector's mansion, and to cries of bread or blood demanded that he cut his tithes to allow the farmers to increase labourers' wages. And the final example I'll give, in May 1834 on Barham Downs, 3,000 people met and passed a resolution denouncing the evils inflicted by the tithe system and called for the abolition of the present system of tithes. And the Kentish Gazette condemned the work of revolutionaries and levellers, again that reference back to the English Civil War, seeking to subvert the government. So by the early 19th century, there were widespread demands to abolish or at least reform tithe. Farmers argued that tithes were obstacles to investment in agricultural techniques and innovation, And within the church, there were concerns that the collection of tithe was souring relations with parishioners and encouraging the growth of dissident branches of Christianity, Methodism, for example. And the outcome of all this was the Tithe Commutation Act of 1836. The act transformed tithe into a cash payment tied to the price of corn. It was part of the Whig reform package of the 1830s, and it was a compromise. It was an attempt to reform the medieval tithe while keeping those who benefited from it happy. And of course, one of the outcomes of that act has been such a valuable resource for historians, the tithe maps, which was almost once somebody described as a second doomsday book, because it surveyed virtually the whole country in order to designate who would pay the tithe and how much they would pay. But this act opened a whole new range of problems. And essentially, it meant the continuation of tithe in another form. It was a recipe for the grievances which had developed around tithe to continue throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. And so by the 1930s, we still have a situation where 70% of land was subject to tithe from around about 700,000 tithe payers. And in today's money, the church institutions collected £200 million in tithe. You can see some regional variations in the map. The darker areas are the areas where tithe was the highest, and Kent, of course, is one of those in that category. So for several decades, the 1836 Act seemed to be working in the 1840s, 1850s, in the early 1860s. That period is known as the golden age of agriculture. But from the late 1870s, agriculture entered a depression and the issue of tithe re-emerged. Now, the first protests in what would really become, these were really the first shots in what will become the Tithe War, were against what was called the extraordinary tithe. The extraordinary tithe was an additional charge on hops, on fruit, and some vegetables, market gardens. But in Kent, of course, with the growing of hops, this was a major issue. And in 1881, the Anti-Extraordinary Tithe Association was set up, led by a farmer from Halstead called Albert Bath, who farmed Holgate's farm in Halstead with his brother. Bath was a Baptist, therefore he didn't believe that his money should be going to finance the Anglican Church, and he was an activist in the Liberal Party. And the Anti-Extraordinary Tithe Association won wide support within Kent and agreed amongst farmers and agreed to wage a non-payment campaign against the tithe. And there was a series of big demonstrations at auctions because, as would be the case in the 1930s, when the tithe was not paid, the farmer faced a distress order or a distraint order, and his goods would be sold. And big demonstrations took place at these auctions to mobilize public opinion and to give publicity for demands for a change in the law. And some of these auctions had an element of pantomime to them, but good humor began to evaporate, and extraordinary tithe and the conflict around it became quite a bitter conflict in the early 1880s. The cartoon is a representation of a demonstration in 1883 at Bath's farm in Halstead. And it describes how someone knocked the auctioneer's hat off. That's quite a symbolic a gesture to knock somebody's hat off in the 1880s. And this was followed by various missiles being thrown at him. One of the parties threw a small bag of soot, and his face was completely blackened. Subsequently, his clothes were torn to shreds, and altogether he was severely ill-treated. It's a bit of a journalist exaggeration, but it gives an example of the sort of scenes which were taking place. There were similar demonstrations in in other areas of Kent. I've put on the map there where you can see the little red triangles is where there were significant demonstrations against the extraordinary tithe on the Weald, in and around the Darien Valley, around Sittingbourne. And you can find quite detailed reports in the Southeastern Gazette about events, including lots of names of the people who were present at these events. Here's one from East Sutton, where I'll just read a little bit because it gives an idea how big this movement was. There was an auction at Boytoncourt Farm, East Sutton, which was run by John Chapman. He had refused to pay his tithe, and 34,000 hop poles had been seized under a distressed warrant. The auctioneer came along. Great interest was manifested in the proceedings, and notwithstanding a strong northeast wind was blowing and snow was falling, a number of farmers and labourers, estimated at about 1,500, attended to witness the carrying out of the sale. In the end, the auctioneer abandoned the sale and said he had been brought along in false pretenses. The most well-known incident took place at the Wagstaff farm on the Biddington Road in 1886. The farmer had refused to pay his tithe to the rector, Reverend William Peterson. A bailiff seized 47 sheep and a cow, and an auctioneer from London came along to sell the livestock. And press reports describe how the auctioneer was met by a large crowd of 600 people, and he complained he was continually pelted with rotten eggs and other disgusting things, and womenfolk in the house emptied jugs of water over him out of a window. 6 farmers were arrested, and one of them, Mr. Cooper from Smarden, was sentenced to 1 month hard labour in Maidstone jail. There was a big defence campaign launched, collected funds, organised meetings at local markets, and a petition was raised for Cooper's release, and he was released after about 10 days. And the Kentish Express reported the scenes as he was on a wagon which made its way through all the Wealden villages from Maidstone prison. At 11 o'clock, a triumphant start was made for Smarden, with Mr. Cooper in the verse vehicle, over which were banners containing the words, "Welcome to our martyred friend, and down with Tory tyranny." So this extraordinary Tithe War died down in 1886 after an Act of Parliament alleviated some of the problems, although many of the underlying grievances will remain and would flare up again in the 1930s. After 1886, the focus turned to ordinary tithe, and the conflict continued in southern England. But the front line in the Tithe War after 1886 was Wales, where there was quite a bitter conflict between Welsh farmers who were mainly Methodists, who refused to pay tithe to absent English landlords and to the Anglican Church. And there was a Kentish connection here as well, because E.W.I. Peterson, who was the son of the rector of Biddington, who had been involved in the case I've just spoken about, was appointed agent by the Welsh tithe owners, and in particular an organisation called the Clergy Defence Association. And he toured almost every region of rural Wales with a team of bailiffs and police, and at times groups who were mobilised to support the bailiffs in the Welsh Tithe War. So the Tithe War of the 1880s comes to a sort of truce in 1891, where there's a new Act of Parliament, which took the heat out of it, because it clarified that tithe should be paid by the landowner, not the tenants. And it was the tenant farmers who were the most militant against the tithe. And it also gave some remission if tithe exceeded 2/3 of the value of land. However, the Tithe War starts. The agitation around tithe begins again in the late 1920s, because after the First World War, two pieces of legislation, 1918 and 1925 Tithe Acts, fixed tithe at a set rate. But from the late 1920s, the agricultural depression meant there was a fall in the prices of agricultural goods, and yet tithe remained fixed. And the other big development in these years was that many tenant farmers had purchased their land, often paying over the odds and saddled with large mortgage arrangements. And they now, as owner-occupying farmers, were now liable to tithe. This is a farmer from Elam speaking about the situation he faced. Sorry, there are. I was just going to have. There are few small farms which make any profit at all. Costs are terrible, prices at their lowest, but the tithe remains fixed at an average of 7 shillings to 10 shillings an acre, and in some cases around here, rising to 18 shillings an acre. We make a loss each year on the production of the farm, valued at current wholesale prices. Moreover, this abnormal summer has bereft us of every drop of water on the farm, and we are now carting water from Canterbury for over 40 herd of stock at a ruinous daily cost. But tithe remains fixed. Now, in December 1930, there was a meeting in Sandwich, in the Guildhall, where around 100 farmers met and agreed to set up the East Kent Tithe Payers Association and begin, as in the 1880s, a non-payment campaign against tithe. The campaign spread throughout Kent and beyond. And so, similarly as in the 1880s, farmers who refused to pay their goods, their tithe, had their goods distrained and put up for sale, and auctions started taking place. The first auctions were on the Weald. One of the first was at Ruckinge in September 1931, and the Tithe Payers Association mobilized to disrupt the auctions, to ensure that nobody could come along and buy the stock of the farmer, and would then bid a derisory amount for the stock and hand it back to the farmer. You can see the press report there. Roderick Kedward started the bidding at Ruckinge with 5 shillings. And when a stranger bid £5, there were angry murmurs around the crowd. When the stranger shouted £10, the crowd surged towards him and hustled and bustled him about the farmyard. Well, the stranger was actually someone associated with E.W.I. Peterson, who I mentioned just now, who was the son of the rector of Biddington, who had set up an organisation now in support of the tithe owners, attempting to break this campaign by the tithe payers. These auctions were given big publicity in the press. This is a few weeks later at Stelling Minnis in the Elam Valley. National headlines were made on this one. The farmer owed £19. He was a farmer and his wife, elderly couple. It was a very small farm, and his horse, wagon, stacks of hay, and a pile of wood were put up for sale, and a big demonstration took place at the at the auction. So the next thing which happens in the face of these auctions being disrupted, the church institutions, with encouragement from the Home Office, won a court order that goods would be sold by public tender rather than public sale. And this meant that for the Tithe Payers campaign, the removal of goods from the farms would become the focus. And so demonstrations started to be organized to prevent the goods from the farms being removed after they had been sold for tender. So what takes place is after stock had been distrained or placed under distress orders, bailiffs known as possession men would be placed on the farms to prevent, to keep an eye on the stock. So a whole series of incidents takes place. This is one in Fritterton, where under the nose of the bailiffs, as it said here, farmers in the middle of the night came along and the 12 pigs and the 2 bullocks that they were supposed to be looking after suddenly disappeared from under their noses. Another incident here, in June 1932 at Great Mungen near Steel, led to arrests and fines. And here, a possession man was approached by a farmer and farm labourers, and the possession man said, the men placed a scarf around my neck and carried me to a cowshed, and they then carried him to a cesspool into which they threw him. And when he emerged, the farmer said to him, "You are lucky to have got off with what you have got." Well, the farmer concerned, Frank Solly, is well known today. In fact, he's not that well known, but those who like Solly ice cream may remember him as the founder of the farm, which later becomes the producers of Solly ice cream. The most dramatic episodes took place in Elam in November and December 1932. And here, farmers on 10 farms around Elam refused to pay tithe owed to the Merton College, Oxford. And goods and farm machinery were distrained and put up for tender. And possession men were posted on all the farms. And another Oxford college, New College, purchased the goods, and on the 7th of November sent a convoy of trucks to the village. But farmers had set up a warning system and were able to mobilize in considerable numbers with scouts, with people on bicycles and motorcycles, who would be deployed to try to stop the lorries getting to the stock, getting to the farms. And the lorries had to turn around and leave the village. But they returned on the 21st of December, this time with 200 police in tow. And again, there was pretty comical scenes because police wagons collided with each other on the narrow lanes around Elam, and bailiffs couldn't find the stock, which had been well hidden, and resorted, as this article describes, quite an amusing article, resorted to chasing ducks and chickens around muddy fields. So it was after the Elam events that this company called General Dealers made its first appearance. And this was a company which bought the stock and removed it from the farms under police protection. In the Church of England Record Office, there are 5 dossiers about General Dealers because it was set up in great secret by the church. It was set up with free £1 shares in a way that would be impossible to trace who was really behind the company. And who was really behind the company were the ecclesiastical commissioners, the Queen Anne Bounty, and also the Welsh Church commissioners. And thousands of pounds were invested into this company, not to make any money, because there was no aim to get the money back, but the aim was to ensure that the non-payment campaign wasn't working, to break the morale of the Tithe Payers campaign. General Dealers was managed by men from a military background who employed ex-army men as its employees, but the control of the company, in other words, what farmers would be targeted, was decided by a control commission with senior representatives of the ecclesiastical commissioners, Queen Anne's bounty, sitting on it. And so all the minutes and the discussions of the control committee are all in the archives. They basically reviewed the case of every farmer who owed tithe and decided who would have their stock seized. And you probably can't see the details on this slide, but here we have farmers from Monkton, someone from Margate, someone from Burmarsh, from Aldington, from Little Munjam, and they give quite big details about the farmers' financial affairs. I read the one from a man called Reeve who farmed in Burmarsh. The case is one of considerable hardship, and Mr. Reeve was offered a concession of nearly 50%, but despite pressure, he has paid nothing whatsoever, and so on and so forth. But the report finishes off. His position is probably such that no remission, however big, will help him, but the arrears go back, and the case can hardly be allowed to stand over any longer. And so it was agreed to send general dealers down to his farm to seize the stock. So, you know, if you're doing research about the farming communities in Kent, you probably find information about farmers and the community in these archives. So really, time constraints mean I have to draw the presentation to an end and jump over a large part of the story. But basically, by August 1934, the non-payment campaign meant that the recovery system was basically paralyzed. The Lord Chancellor says it is certain that if the court were asked to execute all the unexecuted orders, it could not do so within any reasonable time. It is a precarious position. In Kent, there were 1,232 outstanding court orders for distress of tithe, which was the largest number anywhere in the country. In the country as a whole, there were over 7,000 outstanding court orders. The Kent County Court Judge Clement says it is becoming impossible owing to the number of cases to administer the law. And it was this situation that led the government, who up to this point have been absolutely intransigent in saying, well, there can't be any reform of the tithe. It was at this point that the government launched a royal commission. And the royal commission reported in early 1936 with recommendations that tithe basically be abolished and turned into a tax paid to the state at a reduced amount, which would be administered by the Inland Revenue. Now, farmers didn't like this. There was a big campaign against the Tithe Bill of 1936. This is a photo of the demonstration in Hyde Park. On the platform, we have the Reverend Roderick Kedwood speaking to the crowd. But in effect, this drew the curtain over the Tithe War. Although the payments to the Inland Revenue actually continued for another 60 years until 1977, when the government finally abolished the remnants of tithe. So my final slide, I think, is one of the lessons perhaps from the conflict. The book draws many lessons and many, I think, pertinent issues that arise from this conflict. One of them, which I haven't mentioned today, is the political nature of the conflict. The Tithe Payers movement was a very strange coalition. Liberals, Methodists, it had support in the end from the Labour Party, but also the British Union of Fascists got involved in quite a big way in the Tithe War. But I want to give the last word to one of the participants in the Battle of the Ducks, because I think it's an indication here of what motivated the ordinary farmers and families who took part in this campaign. This is a letter from the mother of one of those who was arrested and was due to stand trial in Maidstone Court in November 1934. And his mother says, his point of view has always been that you may go on talking forever and nothing happens, but do something and people sit up and take notice. Hence the Royal Commission, a direct result not of talk, but of direct action. Is the highest duty of a citizen to resist bad laws. So I think the Tithe protesters' message, I think, is a message that was as true in 1934 as it is today. Thanks very much for listening.